Well, in our studies of the prophecy of Daniel, we've now come to the last portion that I want to deal with in chapter 7. And I'm going to give you a heads up because probably in the car on the way home, my wife will say to me again, "Oh, there was a lot of material in that talk tonight." So I'm warning you, there is quite a bit of material in this talk because we're going to be dealing with some very, very important issues that will lead us, of course, to the apocalypse. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the book of Revelation at the end of our class. We, of course, have considered up to verse 7 of Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, and we read in that verse that it was strong exceedingly, it had great iron teeth, it devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And we spent some time in our last class looking at the 10 horns, that is the 10 kingdoms that were formed on the body politic of the Roman Empire by the barbarian invasions. And we're going to have a look at that history briefly a little later on. I'll show you a map of the barbarian invasions. But we want to start tonight with this phrase that is highlighted in green on the screen. And stamped the residue with the feet of it. Now, I'd have to say that there's not, I believe, a great understanding of this in our community. So we need to be very careful in the way we deal with it and give the proof of it. Let's have a look at the 4 empires. When you have a look at these maps, you will see that Babylon was relatively small. Medo-Persia that followed it was relatively large by comparison. Right over here to Macedonia, right across to the Indus River in India and Pakistan. The Grecian Empire, of course, was very similar in size and proportion to the Persian Empire. But then you have the Roman Empire. And the noticeable thing about the Roman Empire is that while it was very large, it did not come across to the east. And that, we believe, is what's called the residue. The residue of the 3 former empires that the Roman Empire never conquered. You see, we read, didn't we, in Daniel chapter 7 about the bear. Look at verse 5. It says that at the end of that verse, that the command is given, arise, devour much flesh. And of course, they devoured a lot more flesh, so to speak, than the Babylonians. Huge territory. And of course, when the Roman Empire comes along, it's going to devour the previous empire, but it doesn't get it all. By 118 AD, Emperor Hadrian forsook the conquests of his predecessors, particularly Trajan in the east. They were having great difficulties over here in the east. They were unable to secure this area for very long. They did get over there, but they were pushed back. And he built this line of forts that runs down through modern Syria and Jordan today, that became the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire for the rest of its history. They never got anywhere near the Indus River. They never conquered that territory. And so when you consider what the residue might be, this is what I believe it is, because Brother Maurice Stewart put his finger on this way back in the 1970s. Now, you won't find this in the Australian version of his Daniel notes, but you will find it in the American version, which is what I'm quoting from. And he says about stamping the residue, let us emphasise here is an important statement that has not as yet been fulfilled. Rome has never trampled the residue of Persia underfoot. It has never occupied all this territory. A power must yet arise which will occupy the territories of Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome, to be afterwards subjected to a higher power, namely Jesus Christ. And then he makes this statement, Russia will do this. And of course that's exactly right. Russia will do this. Thus, like the image of Daniel chapter 2, whose metals will have to be confederated together before they can be broken to pieces together, and we pointed out the importance of that statement in Daniel chapter 2, so also this terrible 4th beast vision has a latter day application. So this is the area we're talking about. This area circled here basically by the red, we could probably go a little bit further to the west here with that circle, but this area here is the area that the Romans never conquered. of old. And yet that has to be part of the image empire. And of course it will be Gog, Russia, that will take over that territory in due time by force, because it says in that verse, it says he stamps the residue with the feet thereof. The last time I stamped on something, it didn't last too long. So it's about conquest. Okay? It's about sending soldiers in to take control of territory. And we know, of course, they're already in Syria. It won't take them very much effort at all, once the world goes into the chaos of the time of trouble such as never was, to take over that entire region. They've already actually got bases in Iran. They've got a naval base and they've got an air force base next door in the Persian Gulf right now. They've already got really, I'd say 50% control of Iran's oil reserves. So they're already fiddling there, and it won't be very hard for them to do that. And of course we know that Putin said that if the Taliban got more than 40% control of Afghanistan, that Russia would go back in. Well, of course, it hasn't been convenient for Russia to go back in. But the Taliban, as you know, are in deep trouble. And the day will come when Russia will go back in. They won't make the same mistake again. This time they'll take half of Pakistan and they'll take Iran. They'll completely surround that country and starve it out of existence. It's already beginning to happen. And so we're looking to that day. Now, the important thing about this is that this, as you can see, is the Seleucid kingdom of old. It's called the King of the North in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. And we know that Russia will be the king of the north, but it can't be the king of the north until it possesses the territory of the king of the north. You can't have that title without having the territory, any more than Putin can become the Prince of Rosh without having the territory of ancient Rosh, which is, of course, we know, Ukraine and Belarus and portion of Russia. You can't have the title unless you've got the territory. And so when they take that territory, we get our king of the north. And of course we know that Daniel 11:40 says that the king of the north shall come against him, and we know the him of that passage is the power occupying Constantinople or Turkey. They can come against Constantinople, take that, it becomes the base of operations against the land of Israel at the time of Armageddon. That's why, of course, they have to have that. That's the east, the foot, as it were, of the eastern leg of the image. Okay? Is that reasonably clear? That we're talking about the residue. We'll stamp the residue with the feet thereof. I think that's not too far away. Now, we spoke about the 10 horns who were formed on the fourth beast. And again, this is a little bit of repetition, but I think it's important that we go back and just confirm this, because you read, not only do you read this in verse 7, it had 10 horns, but in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 7, you've got reference to 3 of those 10 horns being plucked up. And it's important to remember this, that when the horns were formed by barbarian invasion, centuries later, or 100, 200 years later, there was all changes made in that region. So you can't just fixate upon the horns as they were at the time of the barbarian invasions. The horns that we will see are different to the ones back then. But that's the point that Brother Thomas makes. He says this, in the 4th century after Christ, it was finally divided into the Eastern Roman and the Western Roman empires, answering to the 2 legs of iron. Though divided thus, the Roman majesty was considered as one. The date of the division was AD 396. In about 97 years from this epoch, 10 kingdoms appeared upon the Western Roman territory, answering to the 10 toes. They were not all strong kingdoms. Part of them were absorbed into a new dominion which arose after them beyond the limits of the Roman territory. And this is the map that shows you those barbarian kingdoms. But it also shows you something important. You see these orange arrows that are pointing every which way? This, as you see, is Europe in AD 526. But beyond 526-27, there was a lot of activity by the Eastern Roman emperors to take control again of the areas that the barbarians had secured. And they were, of course, in support of the papacy. Justinian was the principal emperor of that period. And he wrote decrees in 529 to 533, and later on in 554 odd, he wrote decrees about the Pope having political power in the West. So the barbarian kingdom, or kingdoms, the control by the barbarians of Rome lasted for about 60 years. And that was the seventh head. And we're going to see tonight that there has to be a revival of the sixth head, the imperial head. And of course, we will witness that in our time. It has existed, but it's got to be revived again today. This is what Brother Thomas said about those 10 toes of the image. These strong and broken toe kingdoms have existed upwards of 13 centuries, a bit more now. They are still in being, but not as originally established. Notice the point, still in being, but not as they were at the beginning. This the prophecy does not require. All that is necessary is that there should be 10 kingdoms at the time the image is smitten by the stone. And these kingdoms, I am satisfied, should be on the earth and not upon the sea. That is to say, they should be found upon the Roman continent, we would call it Europe, and not upon the islands, that is the area of the sea, Mediterranean. And that the enumeration of them belongs to the time of the end rather than to the period of their foundation. So what we're looking for, brothers and sisters, for the fulfilment of that prophecy is still some distance away in terms of actuality, but probably not a great deal away in terms of time. As I said on Sunday afternoon in this place, when that Great Depression comes, when we've been taken away to the judgment seat, this world is going to go through the most catastrophic period in its entire history, a time of trouble such as never was. And those times change things dramatically in a very short space of time. Within a few years in the 1930s, alliances that were never even contemplated had become a fact. And we had the Axis powers joined together. How did that come about? All came about because of the Depression years, from 1930 onwards. And so huge changes can come when the world is catapulted into a time of trouble such as is coming upon the earth. What this prophecy requires, we knew this from what we considered in the verses 11 and 12, that all of these empires of old have to be restored, that is, their territories restored into one image empire. So this fourth empire's got to come back. We've got to see it back. And we've got to see it back where the 10 toes were established. This is the territory. The 10 horns were formed south of the River Rhine and the River Danube. And you can see then, if you have a look at the map, you can see the Rhine is up here, the Danube is down here and runs into the Black Sea. That was the territory of the Western Roman Empire until the barbarians came along and took it over and established their own little kingdoms on it. That's got to be restored. There will be 10 nations within that region of Europe that will reform the fourth beast of Daniel chapter 7 verse 7, the Babylon the Great that we're looking for in Revelation 17, the revival of the beast of the sea, as we'll see in our later considerations tonight, of Revelation chapter 13 verses 1 to 10. We've got to see a restoration of that, and it will come under great pressure. It will come upon Europe, if it's not already there, by the way, in part, enormous pressure when the Great Depression hits the earth. So, in looking at Daniel chapter 7 and these 4 beasts, we've got them, of course, seen in another imagery of Revelation chapter 13. Now, Revelation 13 verses 1 to 10 is about what's called the beast of the sea. And the symbols used in that vision given to John is based upon the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7, because this power possessed all the characteristics of the previous beasts. And we're going to have a look at the relationship of that. This is the passage I'm referring to in Revelation chapter 13 and at verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. So there's one of the 4 beasts of Daniel 7. His feet was the feet of a bear, another one. His mouth is the mouth of a lion, another one. And the dragon, that is the 4th beast, as it were, of Daniel 7, gave him his power. So we want to have a bit of a look at that and see what that means for us. Now this is where our chart comes in very handy, doesn't it? And some of you will have been doing some work on this chart, And my challenge to you was, by the end of this series, you should be able to sit down with someone and say, yeah, this is what this means, and this is what this means, and actually guide them through it, at least in part. When you look at the chart, this is the area we're going to consider now. Now I want you to notice how this chart is actually formed. Here we've got the lion, the bear, the leopard, and of course, as we know, right over here on the right-hand side, the fourth beast of Daniel 7, verse 7. So there is the elements of the image. The gold of the image relating to the lion, the silver to the bear, the brass to the leopard, the iron to the Roman. Now, when they put this chart together, you'll notice that there's a progression here. So the bear is just a little bit to the right of the lion, the leopard is to the right of the bear, and the fourth beast well to the right of all of them. You see, it's telling you that there's a progression of history. But along the way, we have this one that I've circled. That is the beast of the sea of Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 10. And you'll notice that it then points to this one. That is the woman upon a scarlet-coloured beast of Revelation chapter 17. You see it up here, mystery, Babylon the great, mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So you see what we are suggesting, and what this chart is suggesting, is that the history, and it goes right back to the 500 ADs, as we'll see in a minute, the history of this period is going to be repeated at the end of the days, in our days. That the power that Christ and the saints will destroy comes with its roots from back here. And of course, this beast is based upon all of these four, okay, because it's got all of those elements, all of those four beasts in it. So there's this progression that takes us from the time of Nebuchadnezzar right down to the destruction of the image power. So that's how the scripture unfolds. And as we've often said, brothers and sisters and young people, if you don't have a reasonable grasp of the prophecy of Daniel, you're not likely to do all that well in the apocalypse. But you're probably like me. When I was a 16-year-old, you know what book I wanted to study first in the Bible? The Apocalypse. What an idiot. What an idiot. You should be studying Genesis first and then work your way to the prophets. And when you've done Daniel and you've got your hands around the throat of Daniel, so to speak, then you're ready for the apocalypse. But we, being human beings, we always want to do it back to front. So this is a very important study for anybody wanting to make real good sense of the apocalypse. You have to have your foundations firmly formed here in the prophecy of Daniel. You can't do any better than turn to Help Us Israel Part 3 and the exposition of Daniel by Brother Thomas. So what I've been saying basically boils down to this. This chart, which some of you will have seen before, is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. Now you'll notice that Armageddon's up on the left-hand side here. And down here you've got reference to the return of Christ. That's not the return of Christ to raise the dead and to take us to the judgment seat. That happens 10 years prior to Armageddon. This is the return of Christ as far as the world is concerned at the time of Armageddon, when he arrives with the saints at the Mount of Olives. So you've got the 40-year period of judgment until all nations are subdued and he has universal rule over all the earth. And this is the pattern of resistance of the Roman Catholic system. Initially, of course, they suffer a huge blow when their suitor, the Gogian forces, and all of that confederacy is destroyed upon the mountains of Israel. It's a huge blow, but that doesn't stop them. Rome itself's not that badly affected. Obviously, there's going to be damage, but it's not ceasing to be the centre of papal power. So they rebuild it, as Psalm 2 says. They rise up against Christ. So that 10 years after Armageddon, Rome is destroyed. That's Revelation 14 and verse 8. Another huge blow. Does that stop them? No. They then go to Central Europe because Rome's gone. They go to Central Europe and they proceed to develop their power against Christ and his government. Until finally, 10 years prior to his universal rule, the papal system and the empire that supports it is destroyed. Not all Catholics, but the empire and the papal system. So when you look at that chart, you've got a bit of a feel. By the way, the work of Elijah with the returning Israelites in the second Exodus is going to be the weapon used against rebellious European nations. Well, what I want to show you is the way that history will be repeated. Because at Armageddon, what Christ and the saints encounter, as you see in chapter 17, these shall make war with the Lamb, it says, of this power, is the revival of the beast of the sea, Revelation 13, 1 to 10. But when Rome is destroyed, what do they do then? They go to Central Europe and they form or reform the Holy Roman Empire, the beast of the earth. We're going to do a lot more work on that tonight, because the Holy Roman Empire is the subject of Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 onwards, but it's also the subject of Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8, all right, and the rest of that chapter. It's all about this power that Christ and the saints will destroy. So we'll fill this out. We'll develop this as we proceed tonight. I hope that just gives you a bit of an idea of where we're heading and how important the book of Daniel is to the book of Revelation. Now, here is something extremely important. You don't have some scribbled notes in your Bible about this, then you really do need to put them in there. Because there are two little horns in the book of Daniel. And they are not talking about the same power. They're both Roman, but they're different powers. One is in the west and one is in the east. Daniel chapter 7 is about the Holy Roman Empire. It's the little horn of chapter 7, verse 8. The Holy Roman Empire. And we'll talk about its history in a moment. Daniel chapter 8 is about another little horn. If you have a look at verse 9 of chapter 8, it says this. And out of one of them, one of the four horns on the goat, which of course represents Alexander's kingdom broken up into four parts, out of one of them came forth a little horn. It's not the same horn as chapter 7, verse 8. An entirely different horn. It's about the Roman Empire in the east. And that, God willing, will be our subject in 2 weeks' time when we have a look at Daniel chapter 8. So it's very important that you separate in your mind these two little horns. They're not the same thing, although they do speak of the same power, the Roman power, in its two divisions. So let's then have a look at what we read in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. This is all about the Holy Roman Empire. It says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. So we've got our 10 horns, the 10 barbarian kingdoms formed on the body of the Roman Empire in Europe over a century or two. And 3 of them are plucked up by the roots, which means, of course, they have no further existence. And another little horn grows up in their place. However, this horn has some distinctive features. It says that before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. You get a bit of a feel for what that means when you have a look at the interpretation of this vision or dream of Daniel a bit further on. What we have here are eyes like the eyes of a man. Well, of course, the man is obviously the man of Revelation 13, verse 18. It's the papal system. And the Pope has his agents everywhere on this planet. You can hardly go anywhere without a Catholic church being around, and therefore priests and their beady eyes are watching everything, reporting back to Rome, particularly in the old days. They know everything's going on, all right? So the Pope's got his eyes everywhere. He can see everything, as it were. And he's got a mouth that speaks great things. You know, it says what it does, verse 25. He shall speak great words against the Most High. Shall wear out the saints of the Most High and think to change times, that is the course of history, and laws, and they shall be given into his hand, etc. So here is a power that could issue decrees which would change the course of history. Yeah, Pope's done that. They had complete control for centuries in the Middle Ages. You couldn't do anything without papal approval. And if you went against the Pope, you were a bit like being in Russia with Putin. You were a dead man, persecuted, pursued, okay? That was the control the papal system had in the Middle Ages, particularly by the height of its power in 1200 AD. So, of course, it's talking about the Pope's encyclical mouth, and you've heard of papal encyclicals. It's when the Pope speaks, he says he's speaking ex cathedra, that he's infallible. Well, unfortunately, many of those encyclicals contradict each other, which, of course, indicates that he's not infallible. But that's the power that they had. He could speak, and everybody would bow and scrape and say, yes, sir. That is the power we're talking about. But at a certain time of the history of the papacy, as we shall see. So this is how it came about. You see there it says that 3 horns were plucked up. Well, the papacy fell out with Constantinople, which of course was the headquarters of the Roman Empire after the barbarians had destroyed the power of the West. The Pope, who relied upon the Eastern emperors who were ruling out of Constantinople in the East, fell out over idols in the 7th century AD. Up to that time, the Eastern emperors had gone along with the papal idols, and their churches were full of all sorts of icons and images and whatever else. But one of the emperors said, no, we don't want these idols. So they cast them out. And the Pope says, well, I'm not casting mine out. And the Eastern emperor said, well, sorry, mate, you can row your own canoe. We're not going to give you any more military support. You're done. As far as we're concerned, you're on your own. Well, when that happened, the Lombards of Italy, in both north and south, troubled the papal system to a point where he became so desperate that he called upon one of his faithful allies, Pepin, the King of France, Pepin the Short. He was, in fact, the father of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's very important in this story. And Pepin came down in a series of campaigns. He overtook the Lombard states, the 3 horns, and he plucked them up, as it were, and he gave them to the Pope. They became the Pope's territory. So guess what the Pope does? The Pope built himself a new hat. This is the triple tiara crown. It's being worn here by Hitler's Pope, Pope Pius XII. And you can see the triple part of this crown. Popes don't wear this too often nowadays, but you know, there was a time when they wore it, because this is actually talking about, notice it's in the shape of a horn, it's a rather fat horn, but it's in the shape of a horn. And it's got this 3 layers to it, because 3 kingdoms were plucked up and given to the Pope. Here is the growth of the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. So this is what happened historically. Here are some maps. Here are 1, 2, 3, the Lombard kingdoms of the Italian peninsula. And they were plucked up by the invasion, the conquests of Pepin, King of France, and given to the Pope. They become what's called the Papal States. See the words here? Papal States. So that is how this came about. And it was in this area, in Rome, in the Vatican, on the 25th of December, 800 AD, that the then Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Charlemagne had been Emperor of the French, basically of most of Europe. He'd been Emperor of the area of Europe since the year 785, all right? So he'd been a king for a long time. But you know, nobody remembers that, because the most important date in his lifetime is when he was crowned by the Pope in Rome as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This is an extremely significant date. And what was formed was what they call the Carolingian Empire. This area here. This is what's called in Revelation chapter 13, from verse 11 onwards, the beast of the earth. So when you've got a beast of the sea, it's a power in the Mediterranean. That's the papal system with political power here. When you've got a beast of the earth, the power is extended right across Europe in what basically was the Roman Empire of old in the West. And this beast of the earth, as we're going to see as we proceed, in Revelation chapter 13, has 2 horns. It looks like a lamb, it's got a lion-like mouth, but it's got 2 horns. It has an imperial horn, that is, the power of Charlemagne and his successors. And it has a religious horn, horn being the symbol of power in the scripture. The religious horn, of course, is based here in Rome. It's the papal power. So you've got this two-horned lamb-like lamb being religious, right, but with a lion-like mouth with the two horns. An emperor in Central Europe and a pope in Rome. So this is Charlemagne's empire. Now when they began the work of forming the current European Union, it was called the EEC. It was formed in 657. That document was signed, by the way, in Rome, in the presence of the Pope. As you'd expect, 6 nations got together to form the EEC, now called the European Union, with 27, 28, 29 members, and more coming, so they say. When they formed the European Union, the entire aim was to reform the Holy Roman Empire. That was the aim of the institution, to bring it back. So really, they were going to call it the Fourth Reich. Now, Reich in German means kingdom, empire. This is the Fourth Reich. There have been 3 before it. The first one lasted for 1,000 years. It was formed in 800 AD. It was defunct by 1805, 1806, when Napoleon defeated the Austrians, and the emperor of the empire abdicated. The second one was in the 1870s under the German general leader Bismarck. The third one, of course, was from 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, and his empire lasted until 1945. He said it was going to last for 1,000 years like the first one, and it didn't. So they thought, we're not going to have this, we're going to have the Fourth Reich. So the whole idea of the European Union was to reform the Holy Roman Empire. They haven't succeeded yet, but they will, as we're going to see. They will in due time. Let me just give you the proof of this. When they minted their coin, the French, back at the beginning of the time when they changed the currency to the euro, remember that? When they minted their coin, on one side was the bust, the head of, guess who? Charlemagne. See the M-A-G-N-E here? And 800 AD over here to 814. So they're not concerned about the previous 15 years or 30 years that he ruled. Prior to that, not concerned about that. They're only concerned about the time when he became the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he died in 814. Now on the other side of this coin, you've got the French words, liberty, égalité, and fraternity. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. One side is iron, the other side is clay. All right? I think we might have said something about iron and clay being mixed. Well, yeah. What's coming, of course, will be a brittle mixture of the iron religion of Rome and the clay of humanism and democracy, or republicanism. Get a bit of a picture about the importance of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, to not only history, but as we're going to see, to the future. Because you see, this is the future. The papacy must regain papal influence in politics in Western Europe at the time that Christ makes his appearance. You haven't got that yet, but it will come. That power, the beast of the sea, is going to morph into this one, the beast of the earth. Now you'll notice something curious here, and I'll point this out in a minute. You see behind this land creature here, looks like we've got an image of what preceded it. You see that? That's very important. Just keep your eyes on that, because we'll point out the importance of that in a minute. So this is the area we want to have a look at. So let me enlarge it for you. Here we go. We're not going to consider Revelation 12, that's the beginnings of the process of the change from paganism to Christianity under Constantine. We come to Revelation 13, 1 to 10. You've got the beast of the sea, Rome in development, 493 AD to 800 AD, showing the eclipse of the imperial system and its rejuvenation in the Justinian epoch, 554 AD, giving papal privileges, that is particularly political influence and power in his area. Then you've got Revelation 13 verses 11 to 18, the beast of the earth, an image of the beast, the development of the Holy Roman Empire, 800 AD, Daniel's little papal horn. Okay, so there is what we're considering in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. And then, of course, the fourth one here, we've got the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, which has to be reformed. Yeah, it's going to be reformed. And the Pope is going to play a very important part in that. But we're really focusing on this particular period of history. The two-horned, lamb-like creature, which we'll consider in more detail in a minute, with the two horns here that represent both imperial and papal power. That's what Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8 is all about. Now, let's have a look at the demise of this power. We're going to come then to the end of chapter 7 of Daniel. We read verse 25, which you can see on the screen. And at the end of verse 25, you read of the duration of this power. It says, "And they shall be given into his hand," that is the saints that we've just seen in that verse, "until a time and times and the dividing of time." Now, this is one of the most important time periods in the Word of God, used all through the prophecy, particularly of Daniel, and into the Apocalypse. It's a period of 1260 years, which you arrive at by looking at a Jewish time or a Jewish year. And as we pointed out in a previous study, when the Jews came back from Babylon, they brought back the Babylonian calendar, which they still use effectively. So they've got to put this extra month in to catch up because their year is 360 days. So if you take a time, that's 1 year, of 360 days, you've got 360. But if you take times, plural, that's 2 times. That's 2 times 360 is another 720. But then you take a dividing of time, that is half 360, that's 180. You add 360, 720 and 180, you get, when I went to school, 1260. That's an extremely important time period. And I'm going to demonstrate probably a little later on just how many time periods over different eras of time have been exactly 1260 years. It's just astonishing. In fact, I think there's a list in the Bible marking notes that we gave you. You can check that out for yourself. But then it says the judgment shall sit. Now, this judgment that shall sit is actually the one that was referred back to in verse 9. The judgment of the nations. So the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. So what that's telling us is this, that the Holy Roman Empire is given a period of control and influence for 1260 years until its end. Now do some maths in your mind. Add 1260 years to 800 AD. What do you get? 2060. How many years is that away? 38? Or am I wrong? Yeah? Not long, is it? Really? It's not long. Particularly when you remember there's got to be 40 years of judgment and the first 30 of that are against the papal system. Really? Yeah. Anybody thinks that we're not close to the return of Christ, forget it. That power has got to go down the gurgler. No other power where this number has been used has failed to be destroyed within 1260 years, on the dot. All right? Precisely on the dot. And it will happen again. The only problem with that is that we've got the date wrong, 800. And nobody thinks that's wrong. Europeans know it's not wrong. History books will tell you it's not wrong. It's fixed. So add your 1260. Well, that's telling me we aren't very far away from the return of Christ, even if we didn't have all the other factors to add to it, as we saw on Sunday afternoon. So what's going to happen to this empire, Charlemagne's empire revived in the earth? Well, it's doomed, and it's going to be given over to others. Look at verse 27 of Daniel 7. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven, that is, this is the entire earth, shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Now those dominions, of course, are referred to back in verse 11 and 12. It says verse 12, as concerning the rest of the beast. So this is the rest of the territory of the empires. The fourth beast is utterly destroyed, as we saw in our previous considerations. But there are other nations, including those in that territory of the image empire. And they will get a release for 1,000 years. But their dominion, their rulership is taken away. And a special class are given the kingdom. And they're called, particularly, the people of the saints. Now, when you have a look at verse 25, it says, he shall speak, this is the papal system, the Holy Roman Empire, shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Now, the saints in that particular case are not you and me and our brothers and sisters of the past. It's not those who will possess the kingdom as immortals. The reference to the saints there is a reference to all of those who opposed the Roman system down through history, like the witnesses of Revelation chapter 11, all right? The political and religious witnesses who didn't know the truth, but they opposed the Roman system. They were against the Pope's decrees. That's a reference to the saints. But have a look what it says about those who possess the kingdom. It shall be given to the people of the saints. So there's a special people among the larger group called saints. There's a special group called the people of the saints. Yeah, that's you and me and our brothers and sisters of the past who had the truth and were faithful to it. That's a very important little principle. It's the true saints that's referred to in that phrase, the people of the saints. You want proof of that? Go to Daniel chapter 12. You know what Daniel 12 verse 1 says? Michael shall stand up, that great prince, which stands for the children of thy people. Who are they? Many that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Those that are in the book of life receive eternal life. It's not talking about anybody else but the saints. It's a special class of people. What a privileged people we happen to be. Okay, let's just let that sort of sink a little bit. How you going here? You're coping with this, okay? So when we look at our chart, we can see, as we've seen in our studies, that this image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream represented the kingdom of men. You had these phases of history, but that wasn't the importance of it. The importance was that one day, at the end of the days, in the latter days, it would stand up, victorious in the land of Israel, and be smitten by the stone power. But it gets there by a progress. And this is the progress that we've been considering. And the history of the past, going back to the 500 ADs, to the 800 ADs, is going to be repeated again. When we get to Revelation chapter 17, we've got a restoration, as it were, of the beast of the sea, when the Pope gets political clout in Europe again. And then when Rome goes down, they resort to Central Europe, and we get the redevelopment, the revival of the Holy Roman Empire again. And that's what's destroyed by the saints 30 years after Armageddon. Okay, I want you to come to Revelation 13. We've got our foundations in Daniel. When we come to Revelation 13, when we come to verse 11, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. Now, if you just cast your eyes back to verse 1, we are told there that the former beast comes up out of the sea. That is, out of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's talking about Rome in the west, but particularly the area of the south of Europe, where papal control was. And now we've got a beast of the earth. So we're going to go a bit further north. We're going to go into the body of Europe, to the centre of Europe. So there's this little transition in terms of the power of the papacy. So here in chapter 13, verse 11, we have reference to another beast. This is the Holy Roman Empire, the next stage of papal ascendancy in Europe, coming up out of the earth. It rose up out of Central Europe based on the empire of Charlemagne, not just confined to the Mediterranean area. It had two horns, we read. As we pointed out, there's a religious power, the Pope, and a military power, or political power, the Emperor, Charlemagne and his successors. It's described as being like a lamb in that verse. Well, a lamb, yeah, a harmless lamb. You see, it looks like a harmless, it's a religious system. It couldn't hurt anybody, really, except that it's got a lion-like mouth, spake as a dragon. Okay, so the lamb is a reference to its religious character, but it spake as a dragon. That is the symbol of paganised military imperialism with enormous power. And it says in verse 12, it says, and he exercised all the power of the first beast, that is the beast of the sea, before him. Brother Thomas points out that that should be rendered, as the Diaglott renders it, in his presence. The first beast of verse 1 to 10 was not totally destroyed. The imperial system was overthrown. Then the barbarians adopted Roman laws and even Roman religion, and their government lasted for 60 years. Then they were pushed out, and the imperial system rose again. And what remained was the papacy and the Catholicized 10 horns, out of which was to arise the Holy Roman Empire. And it goes on to say that the earth and them which dwell therein is a reference to the papal alliance with Charlemagne, which resulted in the whole of Europe submitting to papal political power. And of course the beast of the sea was all about political power, papal political power. So this is another phase of that power, where he's got the emperor of Europe on his side. He's lost the support of the Eastern emperors. Now he's got the emperor of Europe on his side. He causes him, it says, to worship the first beast. That is, to give political and religious allegiance to the papal organisation. And in verse 14, there's another interesting little element here. It says, he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those signs which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. So what's this image to the beast? Well, the word in the Greek is icon. Combines the ideas of representation and manifestation. It refers to the papacy with political clout. That's why that little image, remember on your chart, remember the chart of the two-horned lamb-like creature, the Holy Roman Empire, you see what's behind it? There's an image behind it. What was that? It's the image of the beast of the sea. What's the beast of the sea about? It's about papal political power. And that's what the emperors of Charlemagne and his successors gave to the papacy. They gave the Pope political influence and power, to the point, by the way, that there came a time, 1200 AD, when an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was made to wait in the snows of winter for 4 days for an audience with the Pope. He made him wait outside for 4 days. That's how powerful the Pope became, that he could even then dominate the emperors who had given him the power. Isn't it incredible? So it's a wonderful illustration of what came to pass in history. And in verse 15 it reads, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast, the papacy, should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. This word power, genemi, means the ability to perform. And the Holy Roman Empire gave political and ecclesiastical life to the papacy by compelling men and nations to worship it. As many as would not worship the image were destroyed by papal decree. And that was enforced by the power of the emperors of Europe that followed Charlemagne. Unchallengeable, what they call temporal or political power. Now, is there any doubt? We hear all sorts of nonsense about Revelation 13, verse 18, don't we? All sorts of nonsense. When it says in verse 18, here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. The number of things that I've heard about that would make you laugh under the kingdom. So ridiculous. Let's see what it really means. The title, the Vicar of the Son of God. In the Latin, Vicarius Filii Deo. It just happens to happen. Oh, coincidentally, a numerical value of 666. Latinos, the Latin kingdom, has a numerical value in the Greek of 666. In AD 666, the Pope declared Latin to be the religious tongue of the papacy. In Hebrew, Rome is Romith. Just by accident. It has a numerical value of 666. The Romans only used 6 numerals. When you add the 6 numerals together, they come to 666. The original name of Rome was Saturnia, meaning the city of Saturn. This secret name was revealed only to initiates of the Chaldean mysteries. In Chaldee, it was spelt stir. Numerical value, 666. At the height of pagan Romans' power, Nero Caesar ruled. His name, written in Hebrew, has a value of 666. St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome is said to be 666 feet long. The only thing that I found quite disappointing was that when I climbed to the very top of the Vatican in Rome to take the pictures you're going to see in a minute, the next picture on the next slide, you'll see, it was taken with my camera from the top of the Vatican in Rome. There was only 565 steps. I was very disappointed. It should have been 666, surely. You get my point? Yeah. There's no doubt about it, is there? And in the New Testament, the words for wealth, euporia, and tradition, I think if you were to take 2 words of that system, right, wealth and tradition would be the catchwords for it, are the only 2 nouns out of 2,000 which have a numerical value of 666. Yeah, here is wisdom. Let him that readeth understand. This is the number of a man, a particular man. This is the papal man. This is God upon earth, as Revelation 11 calls him. He's the God of the earth. He thinks he's Jesus Christ on earth. He's the Antichrist. You see, this is the power that Christ is coming to destroy, and you and I hope to be in the company of Christ when he does it. Come to Revelation chapter 17. Now, if you've been following me, you'll know that there's this direct relationship, as your chart will tell you, direct relationship between Revelation 13 and the beast of the sea with Revelation chapter 17. Because when you read about the beast here in Revelation 17, verse 3, described as a woman sitting upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, much of the imagery is picked up from the beast of the sea. This is the first phase. This is the phase that Christ and the saints deal with at the time of Armageddon. Verse 14 tells us that. These shall make war with the Lamb. The 10 kingdoms, the 10 horns of verse 12 will be behind the papacy. They will make war with the Lamb, and he will overthrow them in the company of the saints, as it were. It's very important. So what we have in Revelation 17 is the latter-day manifestation of the beast of the sea, a revival of papal political power following the devastation of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which of course took papal power away. Have a look at verse 16 of Revelation 17. The 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, the harlot system of Catholic Rome, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. They did that in the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. Ultimately, of course, the Pope lost his temporal power in 1870, but little by little, stage by stage, regained the power. Mussolini gave him the Vatican, 100 acres, became a nation within a nation, 1929. Then you got the European Union, or EEC as it was. All of this is building up papal power. And when Christ comes, they will have real clout in Europe. You know how they're going to get that? The time of trouble such as never was. Have a look what happened in Russia when the USSR fell over. People went back to religion big time. And today you cannot rule Russia without the church. They'll go back to religion big time when the great, dreadful events of the time of trouble comes upon them. I don't think that's too far away. We'll have to wait and see. So here we have some very important things. Now, this is what we've been looking at, the scarlet coloured beast. This is what Brother Thomas says about it in Eureka, Volume 5, page 278. He says, after the exposition given of the beasts in the 13th chapter of this work, it will be unnecessary for me to add more than a few words in this place. The beast before us is the beast of the sea, with 7 heads and 10 horns, but with certain additional particulars. The beast of the sea in chapter 13 was the polity it represents in its origin, but the beast of the abyss of chapter 17 is the same polity in the last 30 years or 1 hour of its existence, and previous to its arrival at the perdition into which it goes away. And we know, of course, without going into this in great detail, that this is actually about, Revelation chapter 17 is about the power of Rome, particularly its religion. We know this by identifying the woman in this chapter. Verse 9 tells us the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Rome is built on 7 hills. Verse 10 tells us there are 7 kings. Rome had 7 forms of government. Verse 18 tells us the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. And that word reigneth in the Greek is in the present tense. That is, at the time that John wrote it, which has kingship at his time, which of course was around AD 96. There's only one city that had rule over the earth, and that was Rome. That's why, of course, in their coinage you find the 7 hills. The 7 hills of Rome represent, this is the woman, Roma, and there's your 7 hills. And we know, of course, Rome's 7 forms of government, right down to the imperial of John's day, of AD 96, which was overthrown by the barbarians. Then came the Gothic that lasted for 60 years from 493. Then there was a revival, of course, of the imperial, or the 8th head, that's referred to in Revelation 17, and if you have a look at verse 8 in particular. This is what Brother Thomas says about that 8th head. In Eureka Volume 5, pages 278 and 279. The beast of the sea in its origin could reckon up only 7 heads upon the 7 mountains. But this beast of the abyss can count the same 7 with an additional head, which is styled the 8th. The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and he is of the 7 and goeth away into perdition. The 8th head is the Holy Roman Empire, under his holiness and his apostolic majesty, forming a conjoint dynasty as symbolised by Daniel's little horn, with eyes of a man and mouth of blasphemy. So you see there's this transition, because the power that Christ confronts at Armageddon, the Catholic power, is of course the revival of the beast of the sea. But by the time we get to its destruction, it's the beast of the earth. It's the Holy Roman Empire, when they have to resort to Central Europe after Rome is destroyed. This 8th head, with its spiritual emperor in Rome and its secular emperor in Vienna, as it was when he wrote, has ruled in the midst of the 10 horns during many centuries. But the time has not yet quite come when these deliver their power and authority to the beast's 8th head for 1 hour. So this transition from the beast of the sea phase to the beast of the earth phase takes place after the destruction of Rome 10 years beyond Armageddon. Could I encourage you, brothers and sisters and young people, to take another really hard look at the chart that you have been given? When we come back next time, God willing, we'll have a look at another little horn. It's the one of Daniel chapter 8.